Hello, welcome to Code Snippet. So in this video, we are going to see one of the important topic in Java Spring called as scope of the bean, right? So what exactly is the scope of the bean? When exactly the bean will be initialized in your application? All these questions we are going to answer in this video. There will be obvious interview questions on this topic inside interview. So this is going to be a fun video. So sit back, relax and enjoy the show. So let's first go through the agenda of today's video. Let me bring in the agenda. Spring Bean scope, right? So first we will see what are prerequisites, right? Few other videos that you need to go through to understand bean scope better. After that we will see what is the scope of the bean, and basically there are four type of scopes. So singleton, prototype, request and session. So all of them we are going to go through in this video, right? So let's get started with prerequisite. So I have created a video on Spring Bean lifecycle. So this is basically the life cycle of your Spring. So basically this covers how your bean will be created and what all steps it will go through. All those steps I have covered in detail. So from application start to bean is destroyed, all these steps are covered. How the bean will be constructed, how the dependencies will be injected, how we use post construct, right? How we use the bean, how we can use pre-destroy, and at the end bean will be destroyed, right? So all these steps are covered. And while constructing bean, I have also covered when beans will be created. So there are two type of initialization I have covered, eager and lazy initialization. So here I mentioned that bean with scope singleton will be initialized eagerly and beans with other scopes are initialized lazily, right? Or we can use lazy annotation as well. So all these things I have covered. So it is advisable to go through this video in order to understand your bean scopes in a better way, right? And there is one more video that I have created which is for Spring dependency injection. So this covers how your dependencies will be injected, right? Different type of injection I have covered here. So you can check this out as well. This will also help you to understand bean scopes in details, right? So both these links I will put in description. You can just go ahead and check that, right? So let's come back to this. So basically the scope of the bean defines the life cycle and visibility of that bean, right? So basically there are four type of your scopes, right? Singleton, prototype, request and session, right? So if you see here, four types: singleton, prototype, request and session, right? So let's get started and let's see singleton type first. Okay, so here I have a Spring Boot application, right? So this is a scope demo application. Basically this is our main class file, and here I have a controller package. Inside that I have one employee controller and I have one user controller, right? After that in entity I have this user entity where I'm marking it as a component, so that will cover this class to Spring Bean. I have a constructor. So when the constructor will be initialized, this statement should be printed on the console. After that I am using post construct. So after this bean is constructed, this function should be called and this should be printed on the console, right? And I'm printing the hash code as well. So this dot hash code means the hash code of the user will be printed on the console. This is just to check that which bean is being injected. Is it a same bean or different bean? So that we can check by using hash code. If hash code is same everywhere, that means single bean is being used, right? So that is user for us. Let's ignore this employee for now. Then I have user controller. So this is a REST controller basically. Then I have this user class auto wired here. So basically I'm using field injection. So if you would have seen the dependency injection video, you can just guess that this is a field injection that we are doing. After that I have a constructor. When this user controller will be initialized, this statement should be printed on the console. After that I have a post construct here as well. What this post construct will do, this will print the hash code of your controller, user controller, and the hash code of the user bean which is injected over here, right? After that I have a simple API, let's say fetch user1, which will just print something and just return http status.ok, right? So that's all about our user controller. I have one more controller, let's say employee controller over here, and here I am doing same thing as user controller. I'm injecting this user object, right? I'm injecting this user bean over here. Again, this is a field injection. After that I have a constructor which will print this statement once this bean is initialized. After that I have a post construct which will just print these statements along with the hash code of your employee controller and your user which is injected over here, right? So that we will see which user is actually being injected. After that we have this simple fetch API over here, right? This will again do same thing. It will just print and return http status okay, right? And I have a request mapping over here as well. So API will start with /API. So what I will do, I will add same thing over here as well, right? So that it also starts with API, right? So the overall API will be /API/fetch user1, right? So that's about the code details. So I have explained the code that I have written already, right? After that, let's come back to singleton scope of the bean. So what is singleton scope, right? So as the name suggests, only single bean will be injected, right? So here, if you have noticed, when I explained the bean lifecycle, I have said that in the eager initialization example, beans with singleton scopes will be initialized eagerly. That means while the application will start, the beans with singleton scope will be initialized at that time only, right? Also, one more point to highlight here is that, can you see any scope that I am defining here? I'm not defining any scope, right? That means if you don't define anything, if you don't define any scope, then the default scope of your bean will be singleton, right? Interviewer may ask you what is the default scope of your bean. You can directly say that it is singleton, right? And they may ask you how do we define the scope, right? So that is when the scope annotation comes into picture. For example, what you can do here, you can do scope, and simply what you can write here, you can write singleton, and that's it. This is how you can define the scope, but by default it is singleton only, so you don't really need to write it explicitly over here because the default scope is singleton only. But let's say you want to add another scope, let's say prototype, then you'll need to write it like that. But now we want it singleton as well, so let it be there even if it is by default singleton, right? So as we have seen, both employee controller and user controller are injecting same bean, which is user bean, right? And all these beans that we are seeing are by default singleton in scope, right? So we are expecting them to eagerly initialize. That means they should be initialized when we start our application, right? So what we will do now, let's start our application, right? So what I'll do, I'll just start this application and let's see what is happening over here. So see what it is doing. First, employee controller is initialized. So let's go to employee controller. So here it is coming and it is printing this, that okay, your bean is constructed, and all these beans are being constructed at the time of your startup only. So this is application startup logs only, right? So all these beans are being initialized here only. That means this is eager initialization with your singleton scope, right? Now after this statement, what is being printed? User initiated. Why? Because while initializing your beans, it found this bean first. It tried to initialize it. Then it saw that okay, there is a dependency. What dependency is there? User dependency is there. So what it will do, it will go inside user and it will try to initialize this bean, and that is when it will print user initiated. So next statement is user initiated, right? After that, this bean is constructed. Then it will check, is there any dependency for this bean? So there is no dependency, right? There is no auto wired, something like that. There is no field, right? So what it will do, it will mark that okay, this bean is constructed now, but there is a post construct. So after constructing this bean, what we need to do, we need to call this function. So it will go ahead and call this function, and while calling this function, it will print the hash code as well. So as you can see over here, the hash code of user bean is printed over here, right? So this is basically the hash code of your user, right? After that, which statement is printed? Again, it is going back to employee controller. Let's go back to employee controller. Now it injected this bean, right? Constructed and injected. After that, okay, so this bean is created now. Now do we have anything else to inject? No, we have already injected what we want to inject, right? So what it will do, it will try to call this post construct now because the bean is constructed, right? At that time it will print this statement. So what it is printing, that employee controller hash code it will print. So hash code is looking something like this over here, right? So this is the hash code of your employee controller, and after that the hash code of your user controller, right? So there we go, this is the hash code of your user. So this bean which was created over here is injected over here. So as you can see over here, hash code is same. So that means it's the same bean, right? So the bean that is created in user is injected in this employee controller as well, right? After that, what is happening? We have another controller. Then what it will try to do? It will try to create this bean. It will print this statement that user controller is initiated. After that, it will see, okay, is there any dependency? Yes, there is a dependency which is auto wired inside this user controller, which is kind of a user, right? So what it will do, it will go inside user. Then now what it will do, it will see that the scope of the bean is singleton, right? Then it will see if this bean is already created. Then it will find that in the IOC container, I have this bean which is already created, right? So what it will do, instead of creating this guy again, it will try to inject same bean. So as you can see over here, again user is not initialized, right? It will be initialized only one, which is initialized over here already. So what it will do, it will go inside your user controller, and what it will do, it will inject same bin which was created. It will inject the same bin, and after that the post construct will be called, and at this time it will print that user controller hash code, it will print, and the user object hash code will be the same bean, right? So that is what we called as singleton bean. So any number of time you call this bean, the same bean will be injected everywhere. So that is how the default scope of your bean looks like, and it will be singleton. That means this user object once created will be used everywhere inside your application, and the same object will be returned in every case, right? Now let's do one thing. I will bring in our postman and let's try to hit this API, right? So there we go, here is our postman, and I will just hit this API and it will give us HTTP OK result. That is what we are returning from here, right? And here as you can see, fetch user API is called, right? And the other API was only fetch user, which was coming from your employee controller. So that will again give you the result, and it will again print fetch API. Now by hitting this API, we cannot see much because all these beans are already injected, because this was the eager initialization that we saw, right? But in prototype, the scene will be totally different, right? So that we will see next, right? So that is the singleton scope for us. So that marks the end of singleton. So let's go ahead and mark these as well. This and this, right? So what we have seen for singleton, two important point to highlight here is that singleton is a default scope of your bean and it is eager initialization, right? So and the same bin will be returned every time it is required, right? So that is the point to remember about singleton, right? So let's move forward and let's see prototype scope now, right? So when prototype comes into picture, 2 points needs to be highlighted over here. First is that each time new object will be created and it will be lazily initialized, right? So if you would have gone through the bean lifecycle video, you can see that while lazily initialization, I have given example of prototype scope, right? So all scopes other than singleton are basically lazy in nature, right? What is lazy? So when it is required at that time only it will be created, right? So let's see, let's jump into the code and let's see, right? So what we will do here, let's go back to our employee controller. What we will do here, we will add employee as well. Let's say employee entity we have, and employee also we will add here. What we will do, we will do auto wired, right? So we have injected here as well. Here we will just print something, and what we will do, we'll add one post construct over here as well, so that we can see what is the hash code. Here I will just say employee, right? So this is the component as well. Now what I will do, I will go to this controller, and what I will do, I'll just define a scope. I will convert this scope to prototype. There we go. And what I will do here in the employee as well, I will inject user. Let's say I will auto wire it, right? And let's leave this employee as singleton only. Let's go to user and let's convert this to prototype. Now to reiterate, employee controller is with scope prototype and user controller is with scope prototype, right? And after that, employee is singleton and user controller is also singleton, right? Or let's convert this to prototype as well. This user controller, so both the controller are prototype, user is prototype, only employee is singleton, right? Because I am not defining it over here. Now what we will do, we will start our application, right? We'll see what happens. Now see, employee initiated, right? So last time it first gone through employee, right? So this time also it will go through employee controller first. It will check the scope. It will see that, okay, scope is prototype, so I don't need to initialize it now. So it will leave it. It won't do anything with this. Then it will go to user controller. It will say, okay, this guy also is prototype scope. So let's leave that as well. So it will leave this as well. It won't do anything with this. It will go to employee. And now it will see that this is singleton. So I need to initialize it because this is eager initialization, right? So at that time it will print this. It will print employee initiated, right? Then it will see, okay, there is this dependency I need to inject, which is user. Then it will go to user, right? Then it will check it is prototype, right? But this user is used inside employee class. So employee class needs that in order to create the object of employee, right? So that's why at this time this user will be created. So user initiated, then your user object hash code will be printed, right? So this is basically the bean, and after that employee object hash code will be printed, which is kind of a this statement, right? This one over here, which is inside post construct, right? So that is how your application is started. But if you notice, your employee controller, user controller is not started yet because they haven't been used yet, right? Now let's do one thing. Let's hit the API, right? We'll go ahead and hit the API. So this is the API of our employee controller class. So let's hit it. So we got the response. Now let's see the logs, right? So here, if you can see now, these logs are printed over here, right? So now what it is doing, now as your employee controller is invoked, because IOC will try to create the object of this guy because the request is coming for that, right? And now we need that object. So now we need that object. What it will do, it will try to construct the bean and it will print this constructor statement inside your constructor, right? After that, it will see, okay, what all dependencies we have. We have two dependencies, it will say. First one is user. So what it will do, it will go inside user, right? It will see what is the scope. Scope is prototype, right? So as the scope is prototype, it will try to create a new bean. It won't check in IOC container if we have it already, right? What it will do, it will try to create a new user bean. So at that time, this statement will be printed on the console. So here it is printed. After that, this post constructor will be called and this hash code will be printed. So if you see this hash code and the hash code that we saw earlier is different. So user object hash code is different here and different here. That means this is another bean, right? After that, it will come back to employee controller and user is now injected. After that, it will check the employee. Okay, so there is one more dependency, which is the employee. So it will go inside employee and it will check what is the scope. Scope is singleton now, right? And it will check in IOC container, do we have any such bean? So it will just check that, okay, in employee we have this bean, right? So what it will do, it will inject the same bean over here, right? So same bean will be injected. As you can see over here, employee class is not initiated again. After that, it will just call the post construct, right? And it will what it will do, it will print the hash code of this employee controller and the hash code of your user object, right? So the user object is same to this, right, which it created now, but the employee object will be same as this. So we haven't printed it actually. So what, let's do one thing, let's print it over here as well. So like that we can print it, and let's rerun this in order to see if the singleton bean is same, right? Let me rerun this. Here, as you can see, same thing while initializing your application. Let me hit the API again. After that, let's go back, and here, as you can see, this is the same employee object that was injected here because this is singleton, right? Same object is injected here as well, right? But this object will be different, this user hash code, because the user is prototype and it will be new each time we call our API, right? Let's hit the other API as well. So it was one, right, in from the user controller. Let's see what is happening. So now user controller is initialized, user initialized. See, again a new user is initialized. As in our user controller, we have user as a dependency and that is a prototype, right? And now this, again, this is a new. So all three are new. So first you saw this hash code, then this hash code, then now we are seeing this. So all three hash codes are different. That means each time your singleton bin will be new whenever it is called, right? So that is basically the prototype scope for us. Each time we want a bean, it will be created newly, and it will be created only when needed. That means it is a lazy initialization. So all your prototype beans will be by default lazy in nature, right? So now if we go ahead into employee and convert this as well to, let's say, prototype, and now if we run this application, while initialization, nothing will be printed. As you can see, while initialization, nothing is printed because everything is lazy. Okay, whenever we need it, at that time only Spring will initialize it, right? Now let's hit the API. So there we go. Now everything will be initialized. As you can see, employee controller is initialized, user is initialized. After that, user object is initialized. After that, your employee object will be initialized, and after that it will be printed like this. And now if we hit other API, it will be initialized one more time, right? Now as you can see, again the user is initialized with other hash code. So if you can see, these two hash codes are different, right? And here we are not using employee, so employee is not initialized over here, right? That is how your prototype is working basically. It will create a new bean each time it is needed, right? So that is the demo of prototype for us. So remember these 2 points. Each time a new object will be created and prototype beans will be initialized in a lazy way, right? That means they will be created whenever they are needed, right? All right, so let's proceed and let's see request next, right? So inside a request scope, there will be one bean created for each request. Okay, here in prototype we had new bean each time, but here in the request we had one bean per request, right? For different requests we will have different beans, right? So that might sound confusing, but let's see. Again, this will be lazily initialized, right? Not at the time of startup, rather than whenever needed, right? Now let's go into our application and convert this prototype to, let's say, request, right? This user controller also I will go ahead and convert it to request. Let's say this employee, let's keep it prototype, and user, what we'll do with user, let's say request. Right, now to reiterate, our employee controller is a request, user controller is a request, employee is a prototype, and user is a request, right? Now let's run this application and let's see what happens, right? Now as there are no singleton beans inside our application, we can see that nothing is printed on the console, right? There is no bean initialized basically, right? Nothing is printed. Let's hit one request, right? So let's go to our postman and let's see what happens. So here what I will do, I will hit the request of our employee controller and we got the response, right? Now let's see what all things are printed. Now here the employee controller is initiated, right? That means it will first try to create the object of this employee controller, and at that time it will print this statement, right? After that it will see, okay, we have two dependencies. First is user. Okay, so what it will do, it will go inside user, it will try to initialize it. At that time it will print this user initiated, right? It will see that, okay, this is a request and this bean is inside the same request, because we have invoked a request, right? Fetch user request we have invoked, and it is inside that request. So this bean will be initiated, right? And this will be printed. After that the post construct will be printed and this hash code will be printed over here. So this is the bean which is created, right? After that it will go back here and it will check, okay, there is one more dependency which is the employee, which needs to be injected. So it will go inside it. So here what it will do, it will try to create the employee and it will print this. Now here what it will see, okay, there is one user that I need to inject over here, which is a dependency for employee, right? Now it will go inside user, it will see, okay, this is a request scope, right? And in the same request, do we have any other user which is already created and which is present in your IOC container? Then yes, while creating this employee controller, we have created this user already, right? So what will happen, that same user will be injected in this employee as well, right? So as you can see, user is not being created again, rather only the hash code of employee is printed, right? So same user is being added over here. We haven't printed it, so let's do one thing, let's print it. User hash code will print like that, and let's rerun this code to check it again, right? So again our application is started, but nothing is initialized. Let me hit the API again and let's go ahead and check the logs. So now if you can see here, so this is first user object hash code which was created by this employee controller, right? And this is the second user hash code which is injected inside your employee class over here, and both are same. That means same object is being inserted because they are in same request. Okay, same request, that means this request, fetch user request, both the classes are coming into picture, this one and inside employee, right? In the same request, that why only one is being used. Okay, let's say there are few more usages of this user, still this will be used, right? Because same bean will be used in a single request, right? And when we print the employee controller hash code, you will see that, okay, again the same bean is printed over here and this same employee object will be printed over here, which is this one, right, which we created. Now let me just add few more spaces here and let's hit another endpoint. So let's go ahead and hit the same request again. So it's basically same request we are hitting second time, right? Let me expand this, and now if you see, same thing is happening. First employee controller, it will try to initialize, then user will be initialized, right? Because user is injected over here. As you can see here, this user is being injected, right? So because it's a dependency, so it will try to inject it. After that, the user hash code will be printed, because in the user we are printing the hash code in post construct, right? After that, the employee will be initiated, so it will come back here. It will see employee is another dependency for this employee controller, so it will go inside, and here it will try to print this. So it will print this, that the employee is initiated, and it will see, okay, another user we need to create, okay, and it will see, okay, this has a dependency on user as well, so same user which was created will be injected over here, and in the employee controller this employee will be injected, and after that this statement will be printed, which is this one. Here you can see that this hash code and this hash code is same, and these three hash codes are also same, because it's the same user being injected, right? Let me expand this. But if you can see here, this hash code that was created in this request and this hash code of user which was created in other request are different. That means for this request there was one bean here, here and here, and in this request there was this bean here, here and here, but these two beans are not same. That means for each request, this request or this request, you will have a different beans, but inside same request you will have same bean, right? So that means one bean is bound to your request, okay? So for each request one bean will be created, for other request another bean will be created, like that, okay? So that is the request for us, right? And that is how your request scope will work for each request, right? Now let's say there is one scenario, right? Let's go to employee, right? And this is prototype, right? So let's remove it and let's make it singleton, okay? So this employee will be singleton now, and but if you see this user, user is a request, okay? So what will happen in this case, right? So as you can see, this employee is singleton. It will try to initialize it in while application startup only, right? But at application startup it will check that this user is a request and this is a lazy, right? There will not be any API call we have hit, right? So let's see what happens over here. So let me run this code again. So as you can see, we are getting some error. What error we are getting? Let's see. So it is saying error creating bean with name employee, unsatisfied dependency expressed through field user, right? It is saying error creating bean with name user because scope request is not active for the current thread, because we are not hitting any request, so there is no request. So how this user we are going to create, because there is no request, how we are going to create this request? And our guy employee needs it right now because we want to initialize the user. So this is a problem, right? So whenever you try to inject your request bean inside your singleton bean, that creates a problem, because the request bean cannot be added inside your singleton bean unless we have a ongoing fetch API or any other API running, okay? That means it should be inside your request thread, as this guy is saying scope request is not active for current thread. So what is the solution of this problem? See, it is defining the solution as well. It is saying consider defining a scoped proxy for this bean if you have intent to refer it from a singleton, right? It is giving the solution as well. So let's use this solution. What it is saying, let's go to user. It is saying add a proxy. We will add a proxy mode. Okay, what is a proxy mode? We will add a scope proxy mode and we will say dot target class, right? Now here we are using target class as a proxy, right? There are multiple types as well, right? Default, no, interfaces. So basically target class is used to create a class based proxy, right? So what will happen over here, when it will try to create an employee and it will see user, it will try to create an object, but it is scoped request. And what it will do, it will create just a proxy for this user and inject it inside this employee. So it will not be an actual object, rather it will just be a proxy, right? So let's rerun this code now and let's see what happens. As you can see, employee is initiated, and if you see, this user thing is not printed. The statement inside the constructor of your user is not printed over here, and this statement inside your post construct is also not printed because it's not initializing this object. It is just adding a proxy. And let's hit the API now. So I will just hit this API. Now what is happening over here? Let's see. Now see, the employee controller is initiated and the dependencies are injected fine when your fetch user API is called, right? So main point to highlight over here is that, so whenever you are injecting this request scoped bean inside your singleton scope bean, you need to handle it like that, otherwise your application initialization will fail, right? So that is the use of your proxy mode. Now that is the request for us. So major points to remember over here is one bean per HTTP request, as we have seen, and again lazy initialization, and one more is your proxy mode. Proxy mode is when when proxy mode comes into picture, whenever you are injecting request scoped bean inside your singleton scope bean, you need to use proxy mode, right? So that is the use of proxy mode as well. Now a request also we have covered, right? So let's proceed and let's see session next. So session is basically the last type of your scope, right? So session is very similar to your request, right? So the new object for each HTTP session instead of HTTP request, right? So basically what is HTTP session, right? So whenever a user access any API, a session is created, right? So there can be multiple requests inside your session, right? Let's say let's try to visualize it. So let's say a user hits your one request over here, okay? So the session will be created. So this is request one basically, right? So once we hit the first request, a session will be created. So let's say this entire thing is a session, right? And let's say you can hit multiple requests over here. So let's say this is another request which is coming. Let's say this is third request which is coming, right? So these are basically subsequent requests which are coming to your application. So basically one session can have multiple requests, 1 2 3 4, right? At the end, when user log out, or let's say there is a certain timeout, then what will happen? Your session will be destroyed. Once your session is destroyed, all these things will be destroyed, right? After that, when we hit another request, another session will be start. So this will be your session 2. For this session, a new bin will be created, and for this other session, another bin will be created, right? So whatever number of requests you are going to have over here, you can have multiple requests over here as well, right? Now let's go to the code and let's see. Now what we will do here, let's remove this employee. Okay, let's keep it simple now. We will just have one let's say user, that also we will have a singleton one. So this I will remove, as we have removed employee, right? We only will have user. What I will do, I will convert this to session, right? So this employee controller is now session, right? And this user controller we don't need anymore, right? So let's ignore that. This employee also we don't need, right? But this is again singleton, so it will just be called. Let me remove this component so that it's not a bean anymore. I'll remove this as well, right? And this as well we will remove, right? To reiterate, our employee controller is now in session scope, and it will have only one dependency, which is user, and that user is basically a singleton bean. So whenever we initialize your application, this user will be created, right? So let's run our code, right? So application is coming up now, and as you can see, as this user is singleton scope, it is being injected, right? Now let's do one thing. Let's invoke this API, right? So this time what we will do, we'll invoke it from a browser so that it will kind of start a session, right? So same API will try to invoke from here. So the moment we hit it, it will give us HTTP OK, right? And here, as you can see, the employee controller is initiated and employee hash code is printed, which is kind of a new bean which it created, right? So employee controller is in session, right? So it created this bean for us, and it will inject the same bean because this is a singleton bean, right? So that it created, right? Now let's refresh this. So we are calling it again, let's say. So this time employee controller is not created because we are under same session, right? So let's refresh it again. So it will just say fetch user API, and it is not creating any beans, right? Let's try one more time. As you can see, it is not creating any bean. It is just calling our same beans, okay, not creating any beans. Now how to expire session? So basically let's write a new API for expiring the session. So what I will do here, I'll just copy this. Let's say I will create another endpoint. Let's say logout, right? Here I will say logout, and I will take HTTP servlet request, right? And we will get the session from this request and just invalidate it, right? So the session will be destroyed, right? You can destroy the session like that basically, right? So let me reload this code. So rerun this application basically. So application is coming up. So your user class is initialized, and this is the hash code basically. Now let's call the fetch API, right? So first time it will just create it because this is a starting of your session, right? So employee controller is initialized and this user object is injected inside our employee controller, and this was created already because that is a singleton one, right? So this is the hash code of employee controller, right? Now let's refresh. So once we refresh this, no bean is created, just a API fetch, right? And let me refresh it again. So again, nothing will happen, right? Now let's go ahead and call our logout API, right? So I'll just hit it. So your logout is completed. So session is invalidated. So here, as you can see, fetch user API or same text we have looks like in that logout as well. That's why that is printed, right? Now, as we have logged out, let's go and try to fetch this again, right? So this get API fetch user I'm invoking again. So now, as you can see, our bean is injected again. As we have invalidated session here, next time we hit the API, again a new object is created for this controller which have a different hash code. So if you see, this is a different object basically. So now again a session is started. Now I refresh it, it won't create anything. It will just call that API, right? No matter how many times I refresh, it will just keep calling that API, right? Because it is under the same session. But the moment I go and log out it, right, and again try to refresh it, it will create the employee controller bean again, right? So as you can see, these all three beans are different, and the application will keep using that bean until the session is destroyed, right? You'll need to remember these points, that the new object or rather new bean for each HTTP session, and it will be lazily initialized again, and when the user accesses any API, session will be created, and we have seen how to log out, right, by using HTTP session, by invalidating your session from your request, right? And it will keep using the bean until your session is destroyed, right? So that is basically the session scope for us. So we have seen all four type of bean scopes now, and that marks the end of it, right? So I hope you have fair idea of bean scopes now, all four scopes, and you can use it according to your requirement inside your application, right? So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to hit the red button below and subscribe to my channel, and share this video with your friends so that they also can learn bean scopes, right? And that's it for today. See you in the next video.